Welcome to NYSARC's four-part presentation on legislative advocacy. This presentation provides information that will assist board members, families, staff, and individuals who have developmental disabilities to better understand the legislative process and how they can effectively advocate on issues of interest. While the focus of this training is directed at state legislative advocacy, much of the content can be applied to elected and unelected officials on the local, state, and national level. This presentation is not intended to address critical substantive issues. Rather, it is intended to provide general information that can be used as a starting point to determine how to effectively address the range of issues not-for-profit service organizations such as NYSARC Incorporated face over time. Part 1, Purpose and Background. The purpose of this presentation is threefold. 1, to provide an overview of the legislative process. 2, to give guidelines for legislative advocacy. And 3, to provide concrete tips for effective legislative advocacy. First, let's take a look at some legislative basics. The New York State Legislature consists of two houses, the Senate and Assembly. The Senate has 62 members and the Assembly has 150 members. This two-house structure is mirrored in almost all the other states and by the Senate and House of Representatives in Washington. The legislature includes a system of standing committees in areas such as health, education, banking, insurance, finance, mental health, substance abuse, social services, and many others. Committees are where most of the work of the legislature takes place. The Assembly has about 37 standing committees, while the Senate has 32 standing committees. Each House has its leadership, the Senate Majority Leader and the Assembly Speaker, as well as numerous other leaders and committee chairs. The elected members are supported by numerous staff, many who are as influential as almost any legislator. While some believe that the rules of the legislature change with the day of the week, it can be said that they are complex. However, the process itself consists of very basic stages. First, bills are introduced. They are assigned a number. If a bill is to be eventually signed into law, it must be introduced in both houses and therefore gets an Assembly and a Senate number. Second, bills move through the committee process towards the floor of each house for a final vote. Bills are sent to the committee that deals with the subject of the bill. For example, if the bill introduced relates to public education, it will be referred to the Education Committee for review. Bills can jump to other committees as well if they involve multiple subject areas. Many bills are amended during the committee process. This can take as little as a few hours or as long as a few years. Generally, to have a chance of being enacted into law, the bills that emerge from the committee process in both houses must be exactly the same, without a comma's difference. Most bills die in committee and don't make it to the floor for a vote. In a 2-year legislative cycle, more than 20,000 bills are introduced, of which about 1,700 are enacted into law. Bills that survive the committee process and make it to the floor of either house are usually passed by that house. Those bills fortunate enough to survive the committee process and pass both houses are sent to the governor to be approved or vetoed. Key committees for NYSARC include the Senate and the Assembly Mental Health Committees. For budget issues, the key committees also include the finance committees of both houses. In the State Assembly, that is the Ways and Means Committee. And in the Senate, it's the Senate Finance Committee. We deal with many other committees as well, including Education, Health, Judiciary, Codes and Insurance, just to name a few. All of these committees have their own staffs who are critical players in the legislative process. Almost all of our legislative work is done through the legislative staff. As part of its job of passing laws, the legislature serves a deliberative function. Bills are often introduced to take advantage of this, as a way of generating visibility, discussion, pressure, and action on key issues. It is a forum for public debate. It focuses public attention on key issues through the media, its committee meetings, and legislative hearings, for example. This public attention creates pressure on policymakers to pass bills, introduce bills, examine policies, or issue regulations to deal with issues administratively. In our field, for example, years of advocating regarding extensive waiting lists for residential services led to the New York State CARES program. The attention to the horrific end-of-life situations led to the Healthcare Decisions Act. And the continued focus on the terrible conditions in institutions, especially at Willowbrook, led to the establishment of the separate Office of Mental Retardation and Developmental Disabilities, also known as OMRDD. Part 2, the role of NYSARC in the legislative process. Now on to specifics. NYSARC's role in the legislature is generally represented by the following. NYSARC tracks and analyzes hundreds of bills and issues, including important budget issues. NYSARC works to introduce and works to pass its own bills. NYSARC develops overall legislative strategy for advancing or opposing bills, including state budget items. NYSARC mobilizes the grassroots response of its chapters, families, self-advocates, and professionals to issues primarily in the state legislature or governor's office, but also in Washington when necessary. NYSARC creates and works in alliances with other similar organizations. This is critically important. Alliances magnify NYSARC's influence. NYSARC works closely with a large number of statewide and regional associations in the field of developmental disabilities and, when needed, with organizations in other fields. For issues in Congress, NYSARC almost always works alongside the ARC of the United States. NYSARC serves as a resource to the legislature, answering questions or supplying information on bills of interest. And naturally, NYSARC serves as a resource to its chapters, answering their questions about the legislature. NYSARC spends a lot of time on developing a strategy, either on its own or with its allies. This entails some basic considerations. They include: what are NYSARC's arguments for or against a particular bill? Who are NYSARC's friends or opponents in its efforts to either advance or stop a bill? Should the organization move quietly or make a lot of noise? It should be pointed out that sometimes the opposition will remain dormant if we maintain a very low-key approach. Who do we form alliances with? What outside experts do we bring in to deal with a highly technical, legal, or financial issue? For example, in a major NYSARC legislative initiative concerning a U.S. Supreme Court decision on special education hearings, NYSARC brought law professors and hearing officers to the Capitol with them to participate in the meetings. How do we draft bills to neutralize potential opposition or encourage other groups to join us? Can we, for example, draft a bill so as not to catch the attention of potential opponents? All of these considerations and others entail complex judgment calls. There are no foolproof answers. Any decision can backfire, but rarely can one decision, good or bad, make or break an issue. Needless to say, we try to be extremely careful of those few decisions that can critically affect the outcome of an issue. But again, many times nothing is obvious, and so most important decisions are usually judgment calls that you hope move the issue in a positive direction. These are very different times and likely will be for the foreseeable future. But economic realities is a topic for another long discussion. Let it suffice to say for now that no discussion about the legislature would be complete without at least mentioning the cost involved. It is the single most important consideration there is. Before we begin our advocacy efforts, we must answer the following questions. Is there a cost to an issue we want to advance? If so, how can we justify the cost? How can we pay for it? How can we minimize it? Answers to the above questions can be highly technical. In the current economic climate, even a very small cost can become a major issue and can kill legislation. That can be good if it is a legislation the organization opposes, and bad if it is an important legislation we are supporting. What are the sources of the legislation we deal with? First, there is NYSARC's legislative platform, as developed by the Governmental Affairs Committee and approved by the organization's Board of Governors and Delegate Assembly. This platform serves as a guide to issues the organization will focus its attention for the upcoming year. Second, legislation can be initiated by NYSARC outside of its platform in response to events as they unfold. For example, in the Governor's 2010 proposed budget, there was not a trend factor. That was and continues to be a major issue for NYSARC and other developmental disability service providers. Therefore, NYSARC initiated legislation requiring a trend factor for that fiscal year. Third, legislation can emanate from many other groups, from the Governor, state agencies, and legislators themselves. This is the most common source of new bills. There are scores of these bills. Some the organization supports, some we oppose, and others we take no position on.